We take it for granted now that the money, the public's money, is to educate kids, and it should follow the kid, that it's the kid's money for their education. When we look back 30 years ago and relive this history, that is not the case. That's not the assumption. That was not the mindset. The mindset is that money was the district's. So as advocates, we say, put the money in a backpack and let it follow the kid.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Fashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom, powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Well, friends, welcome back to the Bold by Choice podcast. I am your host, Fashanta Harris, and if you have been walking with us through this season, you already know chartering didn't just spring out of the ground. It started with one law in one state, and that was Minnesota. But then it caught fire and it began to spread. So today we're going to be asking, how did chartering go from that bold idea to a nationwide movement? And we're zooming in on two specific states, and those two are Michigan and Florida. Very different places, very different politics, different people. But what they shared was a sense of urgency and a willingness to act when it truly mattered. So grab a cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and join us. Jim, I want to pass it to you. Share with us a little bit more about what folks will learn today.
Oh, they're going to learn about what leadership looks like, sounds like, and feels like. They're going to learn what it means to be bold by choice. They're going to learn some history, but it's not for history's sake. It's for how they can lead forward today. We've got some cool stories with some founders, right? Founders that made things happen. And so if you're out there listening and like, hey, I got to make things happen, we've got some stories for you.
That's right. And these stories are held in a very special place that we'd love for you all to check out. And that's called the Founders Library. And so you can find that on our website, founderslibrary.org, and we'll have that link for you in the show notes. So we're going to start with Governor John Engler of Michigan. In the early 90s, his state was facing some deep frustrations with a system that wasn't delivering for every child. And when the legislature got stuck, he didn't wait. He acted. So let's go and hear a little bit from former Governor John Engler himself.
Changing the system, they could keep property taxes very low for a homeowner there, let the utility, the nuclear plant, pay for the schools. So we had everybody's attention on finance, and everybody suddenly had to come to the table on that.
And prior to that, you couldn't get them all to the table, right?
Right. No, you could not.
Because if I had it, I wasn't going to negotiate.
Yeah. Why should I negotiate? I love what I've got, or make me an offer. And it was, they just sat it out. And then there were enough legislators that were representing those kinds of districts. You just couldn't ever seemingly make the math work and put together majorities for reform. So now everybody's got to be at the table. Everybody's in this, and they're worked up, obviously. But it then opens the door and say, okay, we're going to fix the finance, but we've got a lot of other challenges in education. We think the system can be better. And I think in the speech, and you've mentioned this in some of the research you did, and we put it in the speech as well. There were kids that were in school districts where they were literally kind of making up addresses with a member of the family, or I used to, Detroit, in those days there were residency requirements for Detroit police and fire. Well, they didn't want their children in the Detroit public schools, so many of them had, a fake address in Detroit and another address maybe in Macomb County or Oakland County because they wanted their kids in what they determined was a better school. So we thought choice among traditional public schools is important. We certainly allow choice among your community colleges and your universities. You get to choose. You get to choose your public hospital or your community hospital. You don't have to go to the one closest to you. You can go across town if that's where your doctor is, or that's where you think the better treatment might be for, the purpose you're needing to be in the hospital. So choice about services is pretty accepted, and certainly it is the essence of the private sector. You don't have to, you can go to Burger King or McDonald's. You don't have to be assigned to one, or you can even go to Wendy's. So I mean, you can have all kinds of choices in all kinds of ways. And not that we for a moment suggested schools were like a fast food or even a community hospital, but they certainly aren't very different than a university. And you because you're from Washtenaw County, you didn't have to go to Eastern Michigan. You come up north, go to Central, you go all the way to the UP and go to Michigan Tech if you wanted. So we thought that was important, create more choices. And then we also said, well, the other thing that's happening, over in Minnesota, they've been talking about these charter public schools, which are, the way to think about that is they're still public schools in every way. I mean, you can't have selective admission. You can't say, I'm going to build the best football program and I'm going to go recruit all the football players come to my school. You had to have a non-discriminatory process. You could allow, and we did under our law, if the second son wins the lottery and is in the school, other family members can come there. But beyond that, it really was a random selection. But we thought that ought to encourage people to do all kinds of different things.
So Don and Jim, what I love about this clip is highlighting some of the context that made Michigan pretty fertile soil for a movement such as a school choice movement. What do you all think about what was happening in Michigan and the context around this moment that Engler was involved with in scaling the chartering idea?
Vashanta, this is, as you like to say, my jam.
That's my word. I love that.
This brings back so many memories, but I'm going to try and say three things and I'll try and get at them. Number one, today we hear charter schools are free, public, and open to all.
Yes.
And sometimes that sounds like a marketing slogan, but it's not. And I want the listeners to go back to what Governor Engler said. Now, context, right? Think 1993, 94, 95. And basically what we say, part of our quest, part of what attracted me to chartering is I don't believe a kid's destiny should be because of their zip code. Mm-hmm. And when he talks about residency requirements for police and fire, when he talks about the border lines, like that is true. The stories from that era are horrific. We wouldn't accept them today. But that was commonplace. That was normal. That had to be busted and changed. And he was the leader that took it on. Yeah. We hear about charters being open to all. You just heard that. No selective admission. You heard him talk about random selection process. We call them lotteries. But you also heard him talk about sibling preference. Like if the big brother gets in, let's keep families together. And so when we think about chartering being good for students, being good for families, being good for communities, you heard all of that in there. But you also heard money. Mm-hmm. And I want people to really resonate on that because, boy, I'll tell you, you can debate a lot of things, but when the money's not there, it brings pressure and pressure for change. And Engler's story, and my doctoral dissertation was about this, was how when the school funding system changed, it ushered in the opportunity for choice and charters.
Yes.
And to think that people made fake addresses so they could get their kids into schools, that's not story. That's not legend. That's true.
And it means that it was really important for parents. Later in the story, he talks about because the public funding system was truly based on property taxes, the complete difference. There could be one child per pupil funding back in the 90s at, say, $3,000. I'm just using that as an example. And another's is at $10,000. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket science to see that that's completely inequitable when we think about the services that all students would need.
Well, and I got a few years on Don. One, I'm a little older, but two, I got letters behind my name that he's working on. But I say that to say, Don is steeped into this research and this history like no other. But Don also was the House legislative analyst, and he knows Michigan school code inside and out. So he can tell you the structure and the changes and how big that was.
Vashanta, your numbers are pretty close in that. The gap between the funding differential between the lowest funded and highest funded districts in Michigan before the passage of Proposal A was about 4 times. So
Wow.
yeah, so it was about
Mhm.
3,000 to 12,000 between the lowest funded and the highest funded. And after Proposal A, one of the beautiful things that Proposal A did was it put in place a mechanism that closed the funding gap for operational funding between the highest and lowest funded districts and schools in Michigan, which has just been a tremendous accomplishment over the last 30 years since it's been in place to get equitable funding for all students throughout Michigan. So that's been fascinating. But another thing that Proposal A did that is just so critical to the success of charter schools in Michigan is it decoupled funding from where a student lived.
Mhm.
So rather than having a property tax-based funding system that goes through the school district, it became a state responsibility. And that allowed funding to be portable. And that portability allowed for parents to make choices and go across school lines. What you'll see has happened in a lot of states is some states in the early years still required um, funding to be collected at the local level by the district and then shared with the charter. And that created a really awkward system because districts, how much money goes where and how and when. In Michigan, funding always flowed directly from the state to the charters, which made choice much more easier to implement in a lot of ways. Because once a parent makes a choice, the money automatically follows, and that allowed for growth and scale.
Don, I love how you went after that, and I'm going to just color it up a bit. So, as advocates, we say put the money in a backpack and let it follow the kid. Well, that had to be done through policy, through law. And that's exactly what you're speaking to, Don. And that was so foundational. In the places that didn't let the money follow the kid, really awkward, tenuous, tension filled conflict between charter public schools and districts because it was my money.
Jim, we were talking the other day, and a phrase that I like to use is pressure creates the conditions for change. When we think about what was happening in Michigan back in the early 90s, I'd love to hear you and Don's thoughts on what were those pressures bubbling up, and how did Proposal A really start to be shaped as a potential solution?
Bashant, in today's terms, we'd say we had a really unfair system, an inequitable system, because we had school districts that were the haves and we had school districts that were the have nots. And it largely depended on your property taxes. Did you have business and industry? You heard Governor Engler talk about a nuclear plant, right? Well, that generated a lot of revenue. And so the history of this, and this was my doctoral dissertation on the history, is governor after governor for decades tried to create a fairer funding system. But those that had wouldn't come to the table. As Governor Engler said, make me a deal. Well, what happened is this legislative dynamic where they actually eliminated the school funding system. And now everybody had to come to the table. And that's where Engler worked his magic, because he said, we're not just going to change the funding system and have the money follow the kid. We're going to create choices and they can take that money with them.
And Jim, if I can interject, the other side of the coin is, why did the legislature eliminate the school funding system? So at the time, schools were funded primarily based off of property taxes. It was a local responsibility. And as Jim said, if you had business and industry in your district, you were doing great. If you didn't, you weren't. But from a homeowner perspective, Michigan's property tax system allowed for increases to the point that a lot of people who would own their houses for 10, 20, 30 years were paying more in property taxes than they were paying their mortgages. So people
Wow.
were literally being taxed out of their houses in some instances, and it was an untenable situation. So the legislature was facing an immense pressure to do something around the property tax situation. And that's when a bill was introduced in the state Senate to just eliminate the entire system and start over. I don't think that the state senator who introduced it really thought that it would get traction, but it sure did. It made it to Governor Engler's desk. He signed it into law, and that created a situation where the legislature had to act and to do something. And in that situation, that's what Governor Engler used to create the pressures that changed the school finance system to what it is today and also allowed for choice to come into Michigan.
Yeah, we hear, don't let a crisis go to waste. When that funding system was eliminated, it created the crisis, the pressure, the timeline to bring everything together. And it also fundamentally changed. It allowed this idea that the money could follow the kid. And so what the legislature did was created a state foundation grant, which essentially meant each student has a certain amount of money allocated to them and it follows them to the school that they choose. Now, the public school that they choose.
And because of that foundation grant, Michigan did not face the same pressures that other states did, where within other states, funding was still collected at the local level by the school district, and then the district had to share it with a charter school that might be in the district, which creates an awkward situation, fights over student counts, just a tension that doesn't need to be there. Michigan was able to bypass all of that by providing funding directly from the state to the charter school, which created a condition that allowed for choice to flourish here.
So, Vashanta, to put it into the advocacy rhetoric, charter schools are draining the resources from the real public schools. Well, where did that come from? It came from this idea that there could be two sectors of public education, the conventional system and the charter public system, and that the money could follow the kid. And the argument always has been it's not the district's money, it's the kids' money. The public taxes themselves to fund kids and their education. And the kids now had a choice. And this was really the beginning of moving from an era of assignment, right? Based on where you live, you're assigned to public school, to an era of choice. You could pick your public school. And that was foundational to where we've come to today. A key to understand the Michigan story is what was happening as a state and the conditions at the time that had to be dealt with. Michigan's Constitution has a very restrictive, what we call Blaine Amendment. We've been hearing about that with Supreme Court cases and this issue of public actors. Don, Michigan's first charter law was struck down. It was also struck down in the Court of Appeals. It took 3 years for the Michigan Supreme Court to finally say this law actually was constitutional. What was the inside story of what was going on in the structure and why did that matter?
Yeah, that's right, Jim. And I'll go back even before that. Michigan's original charter schools law never really made it off the books. So if you'll remember, back in 1993, Governor Engler and team had a very narrow window to try to pass this. They wanted to get something passed during the momentum of Proposal A. So two charter bills were working their way through the legislature. One originated in the House, and it was very what I'll call conceptual in design about providing charters with broad freedoms, and it was very focused on how the schools might operate. And that bill made it to the governor's desk first. It was signed into law, and then the governor's legal team took a look at it. And a very smart attorney here in Michigan named Richard McClellan said, "Oh my goodness, this is never going to pass constitutional muster." So he worked with the sponsor of the second law to really focus in on constitutional provisions that he felt were necessary to make sure that the law passed constitutional tests here in Michigan so the law could preserve and be implemented. Those included ensuring that charter schools were considered school districts, the public nature of the schools, the way that funds were received, and something really important today, how board members are appointed, and the fact that they are public officials who take a public oath of office just like others do. So a second law was written, it got passed, it got signed, it superseded the first law, and then there were the court challenges. It took 3 years for the second law to really take root. But what that did, Jim, was it put Michigan on very, very, very solid ground legally and constitutionally to prevent challenges in the future for our schools to persist in the future.
So some say we're an instant gratification society. That's not instant gratification from an idea to a law to implementation. So that idea that you got to be willing to stick with it to make it work is critical.
Certainly took perseverance, and there are things in Michigan's law that I know that some people would prefer aren't there, but it's important to preserve the public nature of the schools, and that's why being thoughtful in drafting your laws and being thoughtful toward constitutional considerations is really important because that's what makes a law last.
Well, I'm going to throw some shade with love, but if you don't do that hard work, you could end up like Kentucky, where you got a charter law but no schools because they can't be funded.
Then connecting back to the Florida story, the Florida Charter Schools of Excellence Commission in 2007 was set up as a statewide independent authorizer. Jim, you might remember one of our first experiences with that was back in our CMU days when that newly formed commission was reaching out to us for help in reviewing charter applications. And I think you even went down to speak at the Charter Schools Conference in the state at that time. Well, that commission seemed like a good idea to get authorizing out of the districts, but was later found to be unconstitutional. So, again, not necessarily a linear path. It took time to work within those constitutional constraints to get a great law that would stand the test of time and provide more choice for students throughout the state.
And that was the great thing of being part of what I'll call the charter schools movement. You had people from all around the country that cared so much about this. It was their mission, it wasn't their job. And they helped each other across state lines in so many different ways to give birth to this movement and help it persevere and succeed.
So I love that we're kind of bringing this out. When I think about some of our previous episodes, we've talked about how the collaboration of a lot of great folks really started the chartering idea. But here we're starting to see this concept of competition and what that might do to impact an environment. Don, I'd love to hear your thoughts around this concept of competition and how that was shaping the landscape in Michigan.
Sure, great question. Proponents of competition believe it brings out the best in all of us. It requires us to do better things in order to attract students, parents, and resources to your school to do great things for kids. And within choice, there's inherently a competitive dynamic because parents are making choices. They get a chance to vote with their feet and make choices that they believe are best for their kids immediately. One thing that I think is really interesting about the Michigan dynamic is Governor Engler's base premises are just a little different than what we've heard in Minnesota and elsewhere. So when we think about Al Shanker, when we think about Ted, when we think about Ember, what we hear from them is this lab school concept that charters are going to be created to allow for teachers to create new educational models and try new things. And what's learned in those schools will be disseminated throughout the district. So that is the priority in the Minnesota model. Choice is a secondary. Parents get to choose it, and it creates a little bit of a dynamic from there. Governor Engler takes a different approach, and that's choice in and of itself is a good thing and part of the goal. That's really based within the market dynamics that we've seen in books like Politics, Markets in America's Schools by John Chubb and Terry Moe that look at the competitive dynamics that come from market-like pressure that create change because of just those forces. Sometimes you'll hear about Milton Friedman, the economist, in 1955. He wrote about how the free market can improve public education. So what you're seeing within this is just a second stream of thinking about why charters can improve public education. That's through competition. It's not that innovation or trying new things is bad. It just is more secondary to that. And I think one of the things about chartering that is beautiful is we marry those two streams into something that has become bipartisan and supported over time.
Vashonda, there's two fundamentals to that for how chartering has evolved over time. The first is Governor Engler's premise of creating competition that Don alluded to. And so when they created the law, they had a choice of who could authorize schools. Districts, what we have is intermediate districts, community colleges, and public universities. And the public universities are the ones that led the way. I was at Central Michigan University at the time when they became the first to authorize a public school in Michigan and the first university in the country. Now there's universities across the country that can authorize schools, but that was the first. And when you ask Governor Engler why, he was pretty upfront about it. I didn't think the districts would do it. I needed somebody that would. And so he went to the universities. The second thing that's really key about that is Michigan has 550 plus districts. They all have a boundary line. So go back to Ted Coldery. The states must withdraw the exclusive. They all had their own exclusive franchise territory. And what they did with public school academies, Michigan's name for charters, is said your enrollment district is the state of Michigan. So if you can get there, you can go there. And why is that so important? Because at that time, the only provider of public education in a community was the district. If you didn't like that assignment, you had to come up with money out of your own pocket and fund private school tuition. Charters changed that. All of a sudden, you could have a public school choice in your community that wasn't the district. And nobody assigned you to it, you freely chose it.
So, Jim, you've been with this for a while now. Minnesota created chartering, originated the idea, put it into law. Districts were the authorizers with state board approval. In California, the second chartering state, districts were the authorizers, and the innovation within California's law was conversion charters. Colorado, the third state, allowed for district authorizers and also created the Institute. Colorado Charter Schools Institute kind of as an alternative authorizer. Michigan was the first to allow universities and community colleges to authorize. How did that change the dynamic?
Tremendously, right? So if you go back to the foundation of the charter idea, somebody besides the district could create and operate a public school. Well, if only the district can authorize it, that's where we came up with the conversations of like, hey, that's letting McDonald's charter Burger King. And why would they do that? That doesn't make sense. It's not the right incentives. And so this really was about structure and incentives and about allowing somebody out of the conventional public school district system to authorize, to charter, to start and operate. And I think that's key. And in fact, a lot of the battles we see today still are from some of those fundamental structures. I like to tease my friends in California that it's kind of the Forced Marriage Act.
Yeah.
Let me take that a step further. When you look at charter laws in depth, you'll see some laws where you have to do things in a certain amount of days. And if you don't, you're presumed to be chartered or you're presumed to be renewed. And so it sets up a really almost hostile structure. And then if I don't approve you, I can appeal to somebody else and they can say yes, and they force you to get married, right? Force you to get chartered. That's where that Forced Marriage Act comes in. But there's a lot of dynamics that creates. Whereas in the Michigan model, the authorizers by law voluntarily issue charters. So when you voluntarily do something, your heart's in it in a way that when you're forced to do something, it might not be.
And what I love, Governor Engler alludes to it later in this particular interview, and he talks about the vested interest of universities in the K-12 space, because guess what? Those students are coming to them, right? Like in all likelihood. And so I love how Governor Engler had the foresight to make the connection of, if I'm a university leader and I'm preparing for what my future enrollment looks like, I would think that many of them would come from the public school options in the K-12 environment in my state.
Yeah, Vashanta, you're exactly right on that. And universities, Central Michigan University, I think, was educating teachers for 125 years before it got into chartering. So it had a very long history in improving public education. Back in the Grand Valley days, we used to think of chartering as a second way that the university engages in improving public schools. The first way is through our College of Education and preparing great teachers and great school leaders to do good things within the school system. And that provides for a very traditional approach, great approach of preparing the people who are going to lead the systems and educate kids. But by having a charter arm as well, it allowed us as the university to be deeper in the schools, see what's going on, connect with the kids, learn what worked, learn what doesn't, have a more personal relationship with a particular cohort of students, and when they're on campus, be able to shepherd them through in different ways. So the incentives really lined up. The universities have an incentive for a great public K-12 system. They also have an incentive to learn new things to improve their colleges of education and the way that teaching and learning occurs within the university to help create the type of self-improving system that Ted originally envisioned.
So, Don, I get called to advise and consult with different states as they're trying to recruit higher ed authorizers. And they might be trying to change their law to allow for it, or they might have the law and they just are trying to get higher ed institutions to do it. I want to tie two things together. Vashanta said Governor Engler had this vision. Well, his vision actually was ahead of some of the universities themselves because they're like, well, we're a teachers' college. If we charter schools, the teachers won't come, right? And there's some great stories around that. But Don, you and I share that we've both worked for higher ed authorizers. Tell us about how today Grand Valley knows how many kids are coming from the schools at charters to the university and the experiences that they're getting.
Oh my goodness. This is an area that the whole team at Grand Valley, and I'm using team in an expansive way, those who are currently at the university and those who are legacies like I am are so proud of. Because about 8, 10 years ago, you could count on one hand the number of students who graduated from a GVSU chartered school and then enrolled in the university. Today, it's over 500, which is really,
Wow.
yeah, which is really, truly amazing. And that was the result of just a very focused, conscious effort on recognizing that we as the university had a special obligation and a special relationship with the schools and the students. Because if you think about it, a student who enrolls in a GVSU chartered school in kindergarten and completes 12th grade there, we know more about that student than we do anyone else in Michigan, anyone else who's coming in, because we know the environment that the student learned in. We know the student's teachers. We might have a little bit of insight into some performance. That student would have been on campus 2, 3 times over the course of their K-12 career to see what's going on. So that allows us to really know the students, provide a safe, nurturing, supportive environment for them, especially because many of the schools at the university charters are in historically underserved neighborhoods. So students are often first generation, haven't been on college campuses before. We want students who are first generation, first time on a campus to succeed. So we could really build the supports, the packages, the services necessary for them to succeed. And ultimately, I think that benefited more students within the university too, because we were developing that capacity that could be spread and disseminated for more.
So
I
I love
love
bragging
that.
about Grand Valley, Vashanta, because that's where I did my bachelor's degree at. But what's so impressive about that story is what gets measured gets done. And when they started focusing on how many charter school graduates come to the university, the numbers grew and they're
Yeah.
having a phenomenal experience. And this higher ed authorizers group that Don and I have had the good fortune to be a part of, others are taken to this idea. And if you think back to the literature, there's been a push to have a pre-K to 16 model. This is an
Hmm.
example of somebody making that happen. Now, we also have charters saying we're going to get kids through, to and through, right? To and through college. Well, here's a higher ed authorizer, a public university saying, well, we're going to get you to and through high school and through college. How cool is that?
Hmm. That is amazing. I know you're both from Michigan and you're used to cooler temperatures, but I'm gonna ask us to pack up our sunscreen and get ready to head down to Florida for a bit. And so before he became governor, Jeb Bush was imagining what the future of public education in that state could be. We're going to take a quick listen and then we're going to unpack how the chartering world expanded to Florida. All right, here we go.
Across the country and certainly in Florida is impressive to say the least. And the learnings that you have through trial and error, these are typically the leaders of these schools are passionate. They are completely, on fire to make sure students learn, and they're learning as they go. That's the experience I have with charter schools. Is it's a constant. The best schools are dynamic. They're constantly learning. The pandemic has brought that out pretty impressively, I think. In some districts where schools, the traditional public schools, didn't even open until recently, charters were open the whole time, and they made sure that their students were, if they were for 2 months during the March and April, when everything was shut down, they knew whether their kids were online. And if they didn't, they had systems in place that immediately connected with them. That kind of student-centered engagement during the pandemic was found more often than not in the charter schools. And as you said, any of these innovations can be replicated across the entire system. And that's, the beauty of the charter sector is that there was a bias towards action. And in that action came all sorts of lessons learned that then could be applied across the board. And you see how that works. I mean, we have a charter management organization here in Florida called Academica that works in a variety of different states now. They actually saw an increase in their attendance and their proficiency rates, because even though the accountability system was paused for the last year and a half in Florida, they maintained their system of accountability, and their proficiency systems went up because they had invested in remote live instruction. I actually participated as a guest speaker during this time, and it was incredible. I mean, the kids were all totally engaged. They weren't bored. They had done a lot of work to be able to make sure that the remote experience was as good as I guess you can't get completely as good as the classroom experience, but because they were preparing for storms, we have hurricanes here, they had this expertise and they applied it immediately to great success.
All right. So in this clip, we're hearing a little bit about the impact of the innovations of chartering in Florida. And we have what became Governor Jeb Bush over time, who really was an instrumental figure, a key political figure for the chartering movement over time. Jim, can you share with us why Jeb is such an instrumental figure and what role he played in the passage of the law in Florida?
We all hear the name Jeb Bush in the education advocacy world, and we recognize it. And Jeb Bush has done so much. But the story behind the story, as Paul Harvey might say, is there was a guy named Lawton Chiles. He was the governor of Florida who signed Florida's first charter school law back in 1996. But the story of how that happened is fascinating. So buckle up. Guy named Jeb Bush runs for governor. He loses to who? The incumbent, Governor Lawton Chiles. That's in 1994. What does Jeb do? He gets with a group of people and thinks, we got to make Florida education better. And so they help push and advocate for Florida's charter school law. And they get it passed, and it gets signed in 1996. But as we've said before, laws don't implement charter schools. So what did he do? He worked with T. Willard Fair, who was president and CEO of the Miami Urban League. He worked with a guy named John Hage, who's the founder of what we now know as Charter Schools USA, an educational network that educates kids across multiple states. But those three were instrumental with others to launch the first charter school in Florida called Liberty City. And then Jeb goes back and, under failing forward, right? He lost in his governor race. He comes back the next time he wins. And he comes out with the A+ education plan, because the governors at that time were really trying to be the education governors. They knew that for their states to compete, they had to have a great educational system. And remember the anchor of 1983 in A Nation at Risk. And so everybody was trying to figure out the best path forward, how they could create an educational marketplace that would be good for students, good for families, good for educators, but also really good at attracting business and industry.
And today, a lot of us talk in the field about how Florida's led the way in a lot of ways across the school choice movement. But I'm wondering, Don, from your perspective, how does Florida's structure really play a role in what we're seeing today?
A great question. And Florida has led the way in school choice. It's just a tremendous school choice state. Has provided for a lot of growth in charters, chartering, and other vehicles for school choice that have empowered parents to do great things for their kids. If you listen to the clip, if you listen to the interview in its entirety, Jeb talks a little bit about that in Florida, Florida's constitution placed a few constraints on the way that charters could be authorized. And where in Michigan, we have independent authorizers like universities that are able to issue charters, and other states have some sort of independent body. Florida's primary authorizers were school districts. And it took a little while for school districts to get interested in this, and there were efforts over time. This was not a complete linear path. The Florida legislature created a statewide body, the Schools of Excellence Commission, to act as a statewide authorizer. That was ruled as unconstitutional. The legislature put a few backstops in where denied applicants could appeal to the State Board of Education. Universities are allowed to create laboratory schools, and that has since been expanded to allow them to be authorizers. So that's important because over time, the mechanisms, the instruments for chartering, or excuse me, over time, the availability of, excuse me, over time, the types of institutions that can charter have just grown in scale. So that way it's created more opportunities for the creation of new schools. And I think that's really a lesson in perseverance too, that sometimes a law might start where it can start, and then it's important for policymakers and others to kind of muddle their way through and see where they're able to go and grow and expand to create the environment and situation that you really want.
Vashanta, another lesson for our listeners is there's ideas, some of those ideas find their way into law, and there's a lot of laws that sit there unused. They have to be implemented. And the story of Jeb Bush is he stayed with this. He's continued to stay with this. Now through Excel and Ed, he's helping bring ideas and advocacy across the country for better education. But when you think about somebody, are they all in? He exemplifies all in. Whether he was a private citizen or a governor or a former governor, he has stayed with trying to make education better. And in fact, Florida just passed a pretty significant budget bill, and Governor Bush is out commending people that did that, and it's designed to help make Florida better. And so this idea that schools compete for kids. Well, also states are competing with each other for business and industry and economic growth. And that really comes back to the idea of America as we get ready to celebrate 250 years of the birth of our Constitution, is this idea that the states would be labs of innovation.
One of the things about Ember's interview with Jeb Bush is really how personal it is. And the perspective that Governor Bush brings, not just as a policy leader and a governor, but as a school founder. Often when we think of him on the national stage and national debates, and a leader in school choice and education reform throughout the nation. But let's share this clip about just a very personal moment and a personal story that's not unlike that many other founders who might be listening to have had with their schools.
Can I tell you one story? You'll appreciate this, having been through the arduous task of setting up a school. So we had a preschool building that we leased, and 4 or 5 of us on a Saturday. School was opening on Monday, and we were cleaning the linoleum floor for the cafeteria and just kind of getting everything as best as it could look for these precious kids. And I'm walking out the door at 5 o'clock after working 6 or 7 hours there with my colleagues, and there was no flagpole outside. And I'm thinking, this school is going to have a flag, and we're going to raise it, and the kids are going to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And so I didn't know how to set cement. I learned, along with a couple of my friends. We actually bought a flagpole, and we set the cement, and thankfully it settled on Sunday. And Monday, when we opened for business, it was a big deal. We had TV cameras there because it was the first charter school in Florida that opened. And I'll never forget, this little 3rd grader raised the flag up in his uniform, and all the kids outside with their parents there, we all said the Pledge of Allegiance, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was beautiful. And it's the best memory I have of that school, just the unity of spirit that existed and the pride that parents had to be so dramatically, engaged in something to show their love for their kids was fantastic.
Listening to that clip, I just want to point out to our audience that was bold by choice. And to make that flagpole happen just took courage. It took action. It took a vision. I wanted to see the students and their families and the founding teaching team to stand around and begin the new school year, the new school, by looking at the United States flag and saying the Pledge of Allegiance together. Folks, there's a lot of things that make the magic sauce of charters, but what you heard Governor Bush say there was love. Love. No dry eye. That's the kind of spirit we want with chartering. That's what makes our movement special, and that's what our job as leaders is to make sure we love and we bring our best to serve these kids and their families.
Don, I'm really intrigued by these two stories. And in my own study time, preparing for the episode, I struggled to connect the Michigan and the Florida stories. And when I talked to you about it, you brought it together so beautifully. Can you do the same for our listeners?
Sure. And for those of us who vacation in Florida all the time, we consider it to be Michigan's third peninsula too. So there are a lot of natural connections with it. But between Governor Engler and Governor Bush, there are really three big things that unite their stories. And the first, I want to go back to the founding principles a little bit, the first principles of how they approach charters and chartering. So their approach toward charters and chartering is a little different than what we see from Ted Coldry and Ember up in Minnesota, where Ted and Ember primarily look at chartering as a way for teachers to innovate and try new things. And parents can choose those things. So there is a little bit of a competitive element, but it's primarily a lab school concept in Minnesota. Governors Engler and Bush look at it a little differently, and they see the competitive forces that charters bring to public education is a value. So both of them approach chartering from a market-based context that bringing choice, competition, and accountability to the system will improve the system over time. So a little bit different, a little bit of a different approach from Minnesota. And that's part of why I love the charter movement, is because it's big enough to be able to encompass all of the different views as to why chartering matters. The second big thing that unites the two of them are their state constitutions. So in the Michigan story and the Florida story, it's not a direct linear path between idea and where our charter movements are today. Both Governors Engler and Bush had to be considerate of the state constitutions, the constraints that those constitutions placed on them, and how the laws could be structured. And that really shows that context matters. In chartering policy, one size won't fit all. We need to look at what different state constitutions allow and work within them and ensure that the laws can withstand the test of time and legal challenges. And then the third thing, and probably most important thing that really unites the two, is both governors originated the charter school idea in their state, steward it through its passage and its implementation, and have stuck with it for the past 30 years. Governor Bush, through the Foundation for Florida's Future that helped originate and pass the law before he was even governor, to today is tremendous work with the Institute for Excellence in Education, spreading great education policy all throughout the nation. And Governor Engler proposing charters in his 1993 speech, after that proposed so many other great things for kids and public education reform in Michigan, to today, which includes his service on the National Charter Schools Institute's board. So both are guys who have stuck with this for 3 decades. They've helped the laws flourish. Jim, sometimes I think in the academic literature, you'd call men like Governors Engler and Bush policy entrepreneurs. They don't just have the idea, but they help implement it, bring the resources to it, and stay with it to make sure that it flourishes over time.
They absolutely are policy entrepreneurs, and they take the risk and they put their personal brand and reputation on the line, and they fight to make things happen. You know, I think when you look at the two, and we often say chartering is about creating the conditions where excellence can thrive. They both had a similar North Star, but different pathways. Let me explain. Engler took a school finance crisis and used it to birth chartering. And he also brought in this innovation of higher ed institutions to be authorizers. In Florida, Jebb's path forward is a bit different. He pre-lit it. Like, he wasn't governor. He helped create the law, helped pass it, helped launch a school. And then when he became governor, he was able to use the power of that office to bring in something that we still talk about a lot today, which is accountability. He had the A+ plan. Schools started getting report cards. Parents could start to see where their better choices were or weren't. And so they both also exude what I call persistence and fortitude. They both have been at this over the decades. And as governors in that era, they were competing. They were competing for who could have the best school systems to attract the best industry, to attract people to want to move there and live there and play there. And they both understand yet today, when you listen to them, the importance of learning to read early, the power of a great education and how it transforms lives, families, communities, states.
Jim, I'm thinking about Florida. And one of the things, and I consider myself a student of both of you, and in my own learning, one thing I'm really trying to figure out in my brain in terms of the timeline. What were the conditions in Florida prior to the passage of their charter school law? Did they have any similar pressures that we saw in Michigan that really made it a fertile ground for the passage of the charter law in that state?
Well, you had a person trying to become governor named Jeb Bush, and he was trying to run as the education governor. And he lost to an incumbent in 1994, but he helped then create what Florida now knows as its charter school law. And that law was passed and signed in 1996. But then he also took the next step of actually working with T. Willard Fair and a guy named John Hage that we know as Charter Schools USA. And they created and launched the first charter public school, Liberty Academy, in Miami. And so what you see is somebody that's stuck with it. But what's fascinating from a legal standpoint is Michigan's story is the birth of higher ed authorizers. Florida's story was the default authorizer was the districts. And yet they both had policy constraints. One, districts were kind of hard to persuade to get to charter, competition. But in Michigan's model, the universities had caps. But both governors stayed with it. They kept pushing, they kept advocating, and both states exemplify rapid growth. In that era, people, researchers, others looked at states and authorizers and they said, who has high capacity and high commitment? And both of those states were high commitment, high capacity. And a lot of that stems from their leadership.
That's right. When I hear both of these stories and the beauty of how the two of you unpack it, I really do hear boldness and I also hear clarity. Each leader in his own right understood that these changes were not just tweaks, like these were huge reform efforts and they were disruptive, they were daring and super deeply personal. So Jim, would happy to invite you to share our challenge for this week with our listeners.
Our challenge this week is really straightforward. As leaders, you got to find a way to make it work. And that's the Governor Engler, Governor Bush story. They found ways to make it work. They took their constitution, their law, where they were at, whether they were inside government, outside government, to stay at it, to make it work, to find ways. Sometimes they were playing offense, sometimes they were playing defense, sometimes they failed, but they always failed forward. They never quit. And that's our challenge and that's our lesson as leaders. We've got to have persistence, we've got to have fortitude, we've got to be creative, we've got to seize the windows of opportunity. And when they open themselves, we got to have the courage, right? We got to be those policy entrepreneurs that walk through and make things happen. Because At the end of the day, it's what you said at the beginning. They both took action to make something good happen for kids.
Well, next time on the Bold by Choice podcast, we're going to continue our journey across the states. If you haven't committed to this journey yet, we encourage you, go ahead and hit subscribe, leave us a review, let us know how this is resonating in the field. We know that bold choices got us here, and bold leadership will keep us moving forward. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.